to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Dave is joining me today. Dave, I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Autumn. Thanks for having me on. Today's going to be fun.
Is it?
I think so. Yeah, it'll be a good one.
We have received a handful of questions recently from our listeners, which I love. At the end of every episode, and sometimes throughout an episode, I encourage the folks who listen to our podcast to send suggestions and questions, and sometimes people take me up on that offer. So a listener sent in an interesting question that we decided we're going to respond to today. Periodically, we take one of these listener questions and have a Q&R episode. So we'll do our best to thoughtfully respond. And then we can circle back to the question of, was this fun or not? Should we just jump in?
Jump in. Let's ask the question.
Let's read this question. So our listener says, I've been intrigued in the last few years to see an increasing amount of dialogue in left-leaning media around polyamory and non-monogamy as viable, if complicated, lifestyle choices. And then she linked to an example from the New York Times, an article that talks about someone who was living in a polyamorous relationship. In the last few years, Somerville, Massachusetts, next door to Cambridge, passed legislation to recognize polyamorous families. And then again, our listener provided a couple of links to coverage of what passed in Somerville. Setting aside the political implications of all of this for a moment, it occurs to me that as discussions around polyamory become more mainstream, Christians will likely need to wrestle with the polygamy of Old Testament patriarchs. Would you be able to discuss how Christians have historically understood polygamy in the Old Testament and how that understanding might inform how we think about rising polyamory in our culture?
So, all right. That's what we're going to talk about today, evidently. So now the question about polygamy, polyamory, and having a serious discussion about it, I probably, we had a handful of other questions that were submitted. There were great questions too. I probably would have picked another question, just not because this question isn't interesting. It certainly, can pique curiosity, but I would have done another question that was maybe I felt more practical and more sort of people actually deal with. However, last week, Renee and I did a marriage conference at a church in near Boulder. And after we spoke and after dinner, we had just Q&A, and a couple came up to me and they had a very serious question, and it was connected to their family about the rise of polygamy within certain internet pockets of Christianity. And I hadn't heard any of this, but evidently there is some branches of YouTube world, sort of a subsect of Christians who claim Christianity and yet are advocating for polygamy. And it was a very serious issue that this family was having to deal with. So that was all news to me as of last week. And then we get this question, and so here we are talking about it.
Yes. Well, let's take on the question first about Old Testament polygamy. So how is polygamy portrayed in the Old Testament? And how should we first think about that or understand it so that then we can take on the rest of this listener's question?
Yes. So it's good to think of the Bible itself as one story, as one sort of grand narrative that it's telling over all 66 books and the many thousands of years and the multiple authors. So polygamy, when it's described in the lives of the patriarchs, is not the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is actually the story of creation, and we get Adam and Eve. And we get the introduction of this idea of covenant. For this reason, you shall leave your mother and father, hold fast to your wife. The idea of leaving mother father for the man is an idea of breaking of the kind of covenant that you're born into whenever you're under the authority of your parents. And then you hold fast to your wife. It is hold fast is a covenant making term. And then that creates a binding covenant between the man and the woman, one man, one woman, and then that's celebrated by the two shall become one flesh, and they should be naked and unashamed. So that is the model, and and that's the ideal for marriage. And we'll come back to that because it's what Jesus constantly comes back to in his ministry. Nevertheless, the narrative continues. Genesis 3 happens, sin enters into the world. And then, amazingly, when sin enters the world, you think at the end of Genesis 11 that there is no real hope for humanity. This is after Noah and the flood, and then things get better for a little bit, and then they get worse again, and the Tower of Babel. In the response to the Tower of Babel, you do see God's plan of redemption unfold. You have him calling Abram out of Ur, and Abram receives this blessing. Abraham believes God. He follows God's command to leave to a place that he would go to them. And he says that in you, you will be the father of many nations, and you will be a blessing. And through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So you get this incredible encounter between God and Abram. And then the redemption plan kind of unfolds from there. Now, here comes the descriptions of polygamy. Beginning with Abraham, and then through his kids and his kids and his kids, you do get a description of these patriarchs having multiple wives. So then the question is, okay, if this is God's plan of redemption, and you have these patriarchs with multiple wives, what's going on there? Mm-hmm. And the question you ask is this just describing, is the biblical author just describing what's happening, not endorsing it, but describing it? Or is the author somehow prescribing this? Is this kind of God's ideal? And it doesn't take a genius to figure out when you actually read the narrative in the Old Testament that this is a description of brokenness. The practice of polygamy is an absolute disaster and leads to all manner of dysfunction in the lives of the patriarchs and beyond. And there's a lot of incredible heartache and evil that is produced because of it. The writers of the Old Testament do not shy away one iota in terms of showing the fruit of that kind of deviation of God's ideal in covenant, which is what you see in Genesis 2. So that then is, I think, the culmination of the folly of polygamy. You see actually in Ecclesiastes, the description of Solomon and famously is multiple wives and concubines, and functionally it's described as ultimate folly. That practice steers his heart ultimately away from God, and it's a tragedy. So that's kind of what we see as a description. Throughout now church history, as Christians have read about these practices of polygamy in the past, there's been almost universal kind of understanding that the practice of polygamy is not prescriptive. It is descriptive, and it's a demonstration of a deviation or brokenness or fruit of sin rather than a picture certainly to be followed. And this now, though, is really emphasized in the teaching of Jesus, where Jesus himself is asked if it was okay for divorce. Like, what are the instances where divorce, so a deviation from marriage is okay. And Jesus is super clear on it. And he says, it was because of your hardness of heart that Moses allowed for a certificate of divorce. But from the beginning, that was not so. And then he goes back to Genesis 2, quotes about the story of Adam and Eve, and it says, this is God's ideal. One man, one woman, those whom God has put together, let no one separate. That's Jesus' stamp on that. So he couldn't have been any clearer on that. That then becomes the definitive model within the early church, such that even the description or the qualifications of pastoral leadership in an early church is one of the qualifications is to be a husband of one wife. And the whole part of the function of having leaders in the church, like elders that we have described, is that they are models to be followed. So it gets reinforced kind of at every level, this idea of a monogamous one man, one woman relationship as a model of the covenant that we see in Genesis 2, and then ultimately reinforced in our understanding of our relationship with God even.
That description brings to life, Dave, what you said a moment ago, in that we have to look at Scripture as a whole, that it is one story, one unified story. And our understanding of marriage and of God's design, that marriage be between a man and a woman, and it's held together by a covenant, is the story that all of Scripture tells us. That's the picture we're given by looking at the entire story. But I do have a question about the practice in the Old Testament. So polygamy was practiced, as you said. There was evidence of it in the patriarchs, who were incredibly influential in the entire story of Scripture, of God's people, of what we understand today to be our heritage too, in a certain sense, in that we are grafted in to this family, to the church now. And what I was hearing you say is that the patriarchs and then later the kings of Israel took on these cultural practices that were probably common. So practiced polygamy as their surrounding culture did. It was still a deviation from God's design. That's clear because of the account we're given in Genesis, and because Jesus looked back at that account in Genesis as God's intended design. So clearly it was a deviation from that. And yet, in my mind, as I'm thinking about those stories, the various stories that reference polygamy in the Old Testament, God never directly intervened to prevent it, or that I can recall, while of course it's clear that Solomon's many wives led him away. And there are some references like that are similar to that. God never directly, definitively spoke to the patriarchs or the kings about this practice. So what are we to make of that? Clearly, there was bad fruit that came about because of these practices, because of practices that were culturally derived, not in alignment with God's design. And so the dissolution perhaps of families or kingdoms or fighting that occurred, is that what we're to take as the consequence of these relationships?
I think so. And that's kind of how real historical narrative functions. The writers allow us as the readers, I mean, it's giving a real description of what happened, but then we can also pay attention to how did that work out? And is that anything close to the kind of blessing that we see ought to be attributed to marriage as it's described in creation? And the answer is obviously no. So in some sense, we don't see a lot of obvious, direct, divine sort of judgment of that practice as those generations unfold. But the practice itself is in many ways judged generation by generation because they experience the negative and terrible consequences of those behaviors and those adoptions of those local practices. So, I still think it is an interesting observation to say, gosh, well, sure, if God just would have condemned it right away in the practice, but that's also not often how biblical historical narrative functions. You get to see the unfolding of choices, and you get to witness the in some ways judgment of God based on the curse that happens as a result of unfaithfulness to God's commanded will.
How does the question of faithfulness frame our understanding of this whole conversation as well? Because marriage in the New Testament is specifically given to us as a picture of Christ's covenant with and faithfulness to his bride, which is the church. And it's represented as being one, even though, of course, the church is many expressions in various local churches. But the church as a whole in Scripture, in the New Testament, is presented to us as being one body. And marriage is given to us as this picture of faithfulness. And I think that's true in the Old Testament as well. When God covenanted with the people of Israel, he was choosing them, he said, from out among all the peoples of the earth. He chose this one nation, this one people group. And so I think that it's important for us to grasp that in this conversation as well.
Definitely. Or even think of the first commandment. It's fidelity to one God. And so it's the other way around. God is faithful to Israel, but then the people of God, you serve and worship no other God except the one true God. So that faithfulness to the one God is core to the foundational understanding of how Israel relates to Yahweh. It is sort of baked into the very fabric of how it is that we relate to God. And so it makes sense that marriage itself would be highlighted as part of creation and gives us great insight into how it is that we are supposed to flourish as society. So it gives us the building blocks of how societies function and flourish, and gives us a clue or insight into how it is that we ought to relate to God as well.
In this question, as it's posed to us, there's the question of Old Testament polygamy, and then how we as Christians understand and think about that, and how it helps us understand the current conversation about polyamory. So let's talk about polyamory. First of all, should we just probably most people who are listening are familiar with the term, but we should probably just define it too before we talk about it.
I don't mind you define it for us.
I think it just means having multiple romantic partners. So believing that you can be in love with, quote unquote, or experience a loving relationship with multiple romantic partners at the same time.
Yes. So with that as the definition, I think there's a couple of different ways that Christians today can sort of evaluate that practice. We can evaluate it historically. Like we can look in previous generations, and you don't have to go very far back to say, does this impulse of having multiple sexual partners in sort of an open agreement, does that actually work? Does it work to produce a kind of stability and kinds of people and kinds of society that produce any measure of human flourishing? And I think an honest evaluation of it historically is the clear answer is no. Of course it doesn't. It creates further instability. It creates a context where there are children or multiple children, and then the stability for those children is lacking, and there's a further decay and dysfunction and splintering of society. And then all of the various negative societal results as a result of that. So anytime there's a breakdown of the basic family unit, you can put it on a timer in terms of the kinds of societal dysfunctions that are going to happen as a result. That just is the case historically.
It's interesting. I referenced a couple of the articles that our listener who submitted the question linked to, and I want to read a short quote from one of the articles. This is an article entitled, Lindy West thought she couldn't handle polyamory. She was wrong. This is a segment run in the New York Times. They have a feature called Modern Love. So they tell various stories of people who are in different kinds of romantic relationships. And recently, in the last several years, probably since 2020, they have featured many articles about polyamory. So this is one of them. This is written by a writer named Anna Martin. I don't know really anything about her as a writer, but she begins the article this way. Whenever non-monogamy comes up in conversation with my friends, parenthesis, and we are 30-somethings in Brooklyn, so this is not infrequent, end parenthesis, I always say some version of the same thing. I deeply admire the people who make it work, but I don't think I could ever do it myself. The truth is, I worry that I'm too insecure. So there are a number of assumptions baked into this short paragraph. One is that non-monogamy is normal. It's practiced by many of her peers. The second is not an assumption. She says that it comes up often in conversation. So it's a regular topic of conversation. And then the third thing that is evidenced by this article is, as she says, I deeply admire the people who make it work, but I don't think I could ever do it myself. The truth is, I worry that I'm too insecure. So Anna Martin is not questioning that non-monogamy or polyamory are in any way wrong or a bad choice, but that if she can't make that choice, there's something wrong with her.
Right. The thing that's, I think, most telling about that quote is the very last word, insecure. She has a very base, a very probably deeply intuitive understanding that if I am engaged in a romantic relationship, then the fruit of that relationship ought to be some measure of safety. And the notion of having multiple partners necessarily inhibits or it means that she could never really have that kind of safety. So she's expressing it as a kind of personal insecurity, but I would probably press in to say, no, I think this is a basic human desire and need. Which to me, as a theologian and pastor, you go all the way back to Genesis 2. I've never talked to anyone, Christian or otherwise, who doesn't want a relationship where they are totally known and totally safe. And that only happens in the context of a profound covenant relationship, where is that safety, where you're protected from yourself and your own impulses and so is your spouse. That it's the only historically reliable context in which that kind of naked and unashamed relationship can really happen, or at least some measure of that. All the other deviated methods don't work ultimately to produce what it is that she wants. But it is interesting that she kind of sees it as a weakness in herself when in fact, I think she's just highlighting a very basic human need that we all, I think, would admit we have.
There's one other angle that came up in this conversation as I was reading through these articles that I also think is interesting. So in an article covering Somerville, Massachusetts, this is also from the New York Times, and this was back in 2020. The article is entitled, "A Massachusetts City Decides to Recognize Polyamorous Relationships." And the subtitle is, "The City of Somerville has broadened the definition of domestic partnership to include relationships between 3 or more adults, expanding access to health care." This was by a writer named Ellen Berry. In that article, one of the people who was responsible for proposing and helping this ordinance pass was a lawyer. They refer to him as Mr. Davis. So he says, quote, "I don't think it's the place of the government to tell people what is or is not a family," end quote. Mr. Davis, who is a lawyer, said at a meeting last week, quote, "Defining families is something that historically we've gotten quite wrong as a society, and we ought not to continue to try and undertake to do so," end quote. So this is a different sort of argument from a different angle entirely. He's arguing that government shouldn't restrict the definition of family. How can we think biblically about that?
Well, I'm not a legal scholar. And so I'm sure there's some nuance and argument that he's coming from that we'd need another guest to sort of comment on in terms of legal precedent and how that works. Yet I do think, for the purposes of this podcast and this discussion, in response to that kind of idea, that who's to say what's a family and who's to put any rigid definition on that? That is actually a pretty, I think, fraught line of logic. Because, in fact, we do know historically what has produced for stable, civilized communities. And it is an unquestioned fact of the matter that the historic traditional family unit works better to create that kind of stability for a broader community than any of its derivatives. And we also know, too, and we can kind of think about this even recently in Denver, and again, not to get overly political, but this is just observation that we can see with legalizing gay marriage. I have one good friend who is a legal scholar, and he was on the side of I think we should legalize it, and here's the reasons why, whatever. And we would meet, just he and I, for years actually, on this and other discussions, and we would have the age-old debate of the slippery slope. Okay, once we redefine marriage other than one woman, one man, doesn't that sort of open up Pandora's box to now legally it can be defined as whatever, and then there's going to be a lot of sort of problems that happen as a result? He assured me that's never going to happen. It's totally happening now, and I think we see a lot of negative fruit as a result from that. I see this personally, and just in my own friend group here in Denver, where we have friends who are same-sex, got married, and then what's really interesting is the second generation. Their various kids are the same age as our kids, and to see the compounding dysfunction is really heartbreaking, and you never hear anyone talking about that, but it's just a reality that I see every week. So that's kind of my response to that legal argument. I just think that while it may be true that government has gotten this wrong at times in defining marriage in particular ways, I also think it's probably more wrong to deviate from the traditional norm.
Yeah, the legal question is, as you said, interesting to contemplate, Dave. But what is clear is that in the Old Testament, the practice of polygamy did not result in flourishing for those families or for society. And you're pointing out that now in various sorts of polyamorous or open relationships, often what we can observe is that the fruit similarly is the same. It is not providing stability, being known and loved within a sort of relationship that mirrors that of Christ in the church, of God and his people. And so it won't lead to the sort of flourishing and societal stability that we as Christians desire. We have kind of likened the practice of polygamy in the Old Testament today as a comparison to the modern practice of polyamory, although there are modern expressions of polygamy too. We didn't really dissect that much. You referenced it, Dave, in the story you told about the people who were struggling with the situation in their own family, in which someone was had adopted this mindset that there is a Christian way to go about polygamous relationships. And so it is a live question. I had also said earlier that the Old Testament patriarchs who we talked about were likely adopting cultural practices. And you mentioned that as well, Dave. And so culture is extremely influential. It's influencing the writer who we talked about, who I referenced,
Yes.
Anna, who was assuming her working assumption because of what she's imbibed culturally is that a polyamorous or open relationship is a fine and perhaps even good, and that if she can't participate, she's the one who has issues to work out. And so both are various also expressions of the surrounding culture. So if we look at our current culture and like this trend, that our listener is acknowledging, that we hear more and more about polyamorous relationships. And it seems that in general, the narrative, especially in media, like we referenced today, is providing evidence to us that polyamorous relationships can work, that they might be difficult. But if you see it through or fix yourself, then you too might be able to experience this. The angle of those articles is often that in that direction.
Yes.
So what's the underlying kind of cultural message that's at play now?
Yeah, I think this is just one more interesting fruit of the era that we're in of expressive individualism. That the greatest good that I could have is expressing and fulfilling and pursuing my own personal desire and expressing who I am, and that's the greatest good. Therefore, if that's the greatest good, then any institution or any way of understanding society that restricts my desires, that suppresses my desires, so whether it's marriage itself as an institution or religion or Christianity or whatever, all of these are sort of enemies of expressing and pursuing the kind of life I want for me now. And so I think this is another kind of fruit, a manifestation of this broader cultural moment and season that we're in right now, which itself is a part of a kind of postmodern, depending on your philosophical structure of postmodernity. And these are the sort of questions and issues that have been asked, in academia since the 50s and 60s. So none of this is actually new. It's just sort of a current kind of fruit of that today.
As I think about this, Dave, in the way that often these topics are going to come up in our lives, I think of my kids and already what they have interacted with in school or had conversations that are brought up because of a reality in a peer's life, whether that be a perspective that person holds or just the reality of their family makeup. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's something that polyamory, polygamous relationships, polyamorous relationships or families, I do think it's something that we need to be aware of. And as I think about this on behalf of the kids in our ministry and my own children, my desire always is to give them a taste for what is good and the goodness of God's design. And so as we talk about topics like this, or teach on topics like this, where questions of marriage and sex are raised, it's such a good steadying point to return to say God's design is that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that he designed the sexual relationship to take place within the loving bounds of that covenant. And when that is practiced, and when fidelity and safety and love are there within those bounds, then it really does lead to the flourishing of the people in that relationship and the family that results from it. And so the taste for what is good, I think, is always what I want to return to. And that makes, in many ways, these discussions simple. What deviates from that is just not what God has in his best interests for us, for our kids. So I think that actually, when we think about it in light of those terms, that it really becomes simple again.
Definitely. And I would say it's good for the people in the relationship. It's good for the kids within that relationship. It's also good for your neighborhood. It's good for your wider community. It is an absolute stabilizing presence for every sort of part of that communal network that a solid Christian family is a part of.
Well, Dave, thank you for spending time on the podcast with me today, for taking on this listener's question.
Of course.
And
Was it fun? Question mark?
I don't know. We can crowdsource that.
Okay.
It was great. It was great to have this discussion, and I think it is actually a live question right now. So good that we can discuss it here on the podcast. To those of you listening, if you have questions, whether about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.